The day Evelyn sat alone in the waiting room of St. Michael's Hospital in Hamilton, staring at a paper cup of coffee she couldn't bring herself to drink, was the day she finally understood something she had been too afraid to name for years. Her phone buzzed on the plastic chair beside her. She looked down. It was Kyle. She almost didn't pick up. "Hey," he said before she could speak. "So are you almost done? I've got the Hendersons coming over on Saturday, and the basement still looks like a disaster. I figured you'd want to get a head start before you come home." Evelyn was sitting in a hospital waiting room because her doctor had found something in her scan that he said needed a second look. She had driven herself there that morning, alone in the rain, with a thermos of green tea that had gone cold by the time she parked. Kyle hadn't offered to come. She hadn't asked him to. Somewhere along the way, she had stopped asking. "I'll be home when I'm home," she said quietly. He made a sound like he was about to say something else, then seemed to decide against it. "Okay, well, just don't forget." She set the phone face down on the chair. The fluorescent light above her buzzed faintly. A child across the room was drawing something with a yellow crayon. An older man in a plaid jacket was reading a newspaper the old-fashioned way, folded in quarters. Nobody looked at Evelyn. Nobody knew that she was 34 years old and sitting completely alone in a hospital, and that the person who was supposed to be her partner had just reminded her about the basement. That was the moment. Not the scan. Not the diagnosis that would come 3 weeks later. Not even the conversation she would eventually have with Kyle that would leave her standing in the driveway in February with her car keys in her hand and nowhere to go. The moment was the basement. The moment was realizing that she had become, somehow, a woman who could be sitting in a hospital waiting room, scared, and the person on the other end of the phone was worried about whether the basement was clean before the Hendersons arrived. She sat with that for a long time, long enough for the child across the room to finish her drawing, long enough for the old man to fold his newspaper a different way, long enough to start remembering. Evelyn Marsh grew up in Guelph, Ontario, in a house with yellow shutters and a garden her mother obsessively tended from April to October. Her mom, Sandra, was the kind of woman who kept fresh flowers on the kitchen table even when money was tight, and her dad, Ron, coached Little League on weekends and made pancakes every Sunday morning without fail. It wasn't a perfect household. There were arguments. There were stretches of quiet that felt loaded with something unspoken. But it was warm, mostly. It was the kind of childhood that gives you a blueprint, a sense that love, even when imperfect, should feel like something solid under your feet. Evelyn went to the University of Guelph for environmental science. She cared about things with an earnestness that her friends found endearing and occasionally exhausting. She joined 3 campus groups in her first semester. She wrote letters to her MP. She made her own granola. She was, by anyone's reasonable assessment, a person with direction. She met Kyle Donahue in her second year, at a house party she almost didn't go to. He was funny in a room-filling way, the kind of person who made strangers feel like they'd known him for years. He had this quality, it's hard to describe, where he made you feel like you were the most interesting person he'd ever met, and then somehow turned that into you feeling lucky to be near him. It was a neat trick. It took Evelyn a long time to see it as a trick. They dated through the rest of university. They were the kind of couple that other people assumed would always be together. Not because they were obviously perfect for each other, but because Kyle moved with such certainty that it was hard to imagine a version of events where things went differently. Evelyn got a job offer in Hamilton the spring before she graduated, a junior position at a small environmental consulting firm. It's exactly the kind of thing she'd been working toward. She took it. She found an apartment downtown. She was for the first time living fully in her own life. Kyle proposed 8 months later. She said yes. Of course she said yes. She loved him. She had mapped her future around him in the way that 23-year-olds do without fully realizing it, the way you stop noticing. You've arranged your furniture around a single piece until someone else points it out. They got married the following summer, in a backyard wedding in Guelph with string lights and her mom's garden in full bloom. It was a beautiful day. Evelyn has a photo on her phone, still, of the 2 of them laughing at something just off camera. She looks free in that photo. She looks like someone who has no idea what is coming. She kept her job for 2 years after the wedding. Then Kyle got a promotion that required longer hours, and they talked about it. Or Kyle talked about it, and Evelyn listened, which was how most of their conversations went. She would later understand. And it seemed to make sense for her to cut back. His income was higher. The commute was easier from where they lived. The consulting firm had been quietly frustrating her for a while anyway. She went part-time. Then, when they decided to start trying for a baby, she left entirely. The baby didn't come. Not that year, not the year after. There were appointments and procedures and months that began with hope and ended in a particular kind of grief that doesn't have a ceremony attached to it. Evelyn grieved privately, mostly, because Kyle was uncomfortable with sustained emotion. He preferred resolution to process. When she cried, he would wait for her to finish and then suggest she go for a walk or call her mom. She stopped crying around him. She went for walks alone. She called her mom. The house grew into her life in the way that houses do when you're in them all the time. She renovated the kitchen with Kyle's approval and her own labor. She planted a garden in the backyard that her mom would have recognized. She learned to make Kyle's favorite meals from scratch because he had at some point begun commenting on things. Not cruelly, exactly. Not in the way that people describe abuse in movies, but persistently, in a tone that suggested mild disappointment was his natural resting state. The chicken was a bit dry. The rice was a bit soft. The house wasn't quite as clean as it could be, was it? Evelyn learned to anticipate. She got very good at it. Kyle, for his part, was not what anyone would call a bad husband in the ways that are easy to name. He did not yell. He did not threaten. He showed up to family dinners and remembered to bring wine. He made her mom laugh. He was well liked by everyone who did not live with him. Evelyn sometimes wondered if this was her fault, if she was reading things into silences that weren't there, catastrophizing ordinary marriage, being, as Kyle occasionally suggested, too sensitive. She almost talked herself into that version of events. She was very close. Then she met Lori. Lori worked with Kyle at the firm. Evelyn had met her twice, briefly at company events. A woman in her early 40s, put together, confident, the kind of person who takes up space in a way that seems entirely natural. Evelyn had no particular feeling about her one way or another. In February of that year, Evelyn found a receipt in the pocket of Kyle's winter coat. She wasn't looking. She was checking pockets before doing laundry, the way she always did. Because Kyle never checked his own pockets and had once sent a granola bar through the dryer, that was still in certain ways a source of domestic mythology. The receipt was from a restaurant in Mississauga, a Tuesday night dinner for two. Evelyn had been home that Tuesday. Kyle had said he was working late. She set the receipt on the counter. She stood there for a moment. Then she put the coat in the wash and folded the receipt and put it in her own coat pocket. She didn't say anything yet. She needed to be sure. She was sure within 2 weeks. She found the messages on Kyle's laptop, which he had left open on the kitchen table. Not hidden, as if the thought that she might look had never fully occurred to him. She read enough to understand everything. She closed the laptop. She washed the dishes. She called her mom. Her mom said, "Come home." Evelyn said she was fine. She wasn't fine. But she needed to think. She had not worked in 4 years. She had no income of her own. The house was in both their names. She had built a life that looked, from a certain angle, exactly the way she had imagined, and realized now that she had built it almost entirely for someone who had not been paying attention. She started making small plans. She called an old colleague from the consulting firm, a woman named Patricia, but that's someone else's story. She mean to say she started making calls. She started remembering who she was before she became so good at anticipating. And then in March, she went for her annual checkup, and her doctor found something in the scan. It was almost certainly nothing, he said. But they should look again just to be sure. Evelyn drove to the hospital, alone in the rain. Kyle called about the basement. She sat in that waiting room for 2 hours and 40 minutes. When the doctor came out to tell her the second scan was clear. Nothing to worry about, just a shadow. Come back in a year. She cried in a way that had nothing to do with the scan. The nurse looked at her with gentle confusion and handed her a box of tissues. Evelyn thanked her and cried harder. She was crying because it was the first time in years that someone had looked directly at her and asked if she was okay. On the drive home, Evelyn did not think about Kyle. She thought about her mom's garden. She thought about the environmental science textbooks she still had in boxes in the spare room. She thought about a conversation she'd had with a woman at the hospital, in the waiting area, just small talk, the kind you have with strangers when you've both been waiting a long time, who had mentioned offhandedly that she worked for a conservation organization in Burlington, and they were always looking for people with science backgrounds. Evelyn had written the name of the organization on the back of her parking receipt. She walked into the house. Kyle was in the living room watching something on TV. He didn't look up. "So everything okay?" he said, in the tone of someone asking about a package delivery. "Yeah," she said. "Everything's fine." She went upstairs. She sat on the edge of the bed. She got out her phone and looked up the conservation organization. She found their website. She found their contact page. She sat there for a long time. Then she wrote the email. She didn't leave Kyle that night, or that week. These things don't happen in a single clean motion, whatever people assume. They happen in layers. You make one decision, and then you live with it for a while, and then you make another one. Her first decision was to stop performing. She stopped making dinners that anticipated his mood. She stopped checking whether the house was at the level of cleanliness that would prevent a comment. When he made a comment, she looked at him and said, "I don't think that's fair," in the same quiet tone you'd use to disagree about a restaurant recommendation. Kyle was visibly thrown by this. He had relied, she realized, on her not saying that. Her second decision was to find work. The conservation organization wrote back within a week. The conversation she had with their director, a straightforward woman named Angela, who spoke quickly and expected you to keep up, was the first professional conversation Evelyn had had in 4 years. She was nervous in a way she hadn't expected to be, stumbling over words, forgetting terminology she had once known easily. But Angela didn't seem to notice or didn't care. By the end of the call, she had offered Evelyn a contract position, part-time to start, flexible hours. Evelyn accepted before she'd hung up. She didn't tell Kyle right away. She needed it to be hers first. He found out 3 weeks later when she mentioned she had a work meeting and needed the car. He went very still in the way he did when something surprised him. A work meeting, he repeated. Yes, she said. I started a contract position. Environmental consulting. He asked why she hadn't told him. She said she was telling him now. He said that wasn't the point, and she said she thought it was, actually, and went to get the car keys. The conversation about Lori happened 2 weeks after that. Not because Evelyn confronted him. She had played that scene in her head so many times that the real thing felt strangely anticlimactic. But because she simply put the folded restaurant receipt on the kitchen table while he was eating breakfast and sat down across from him and waited. Kyle looked at the receipt for a moment. He looked up at her, and something in his face shifted into something she had never seen before. Not guilt, exactly, or not only guilt. More like the expression of someone who has been waiting without knowing it to be caught. How long? She asked. Evelyn, how long, Kyle? He told her. It had been going on for almost 2 years. She nodded. She got up and refilled her coffee. She stood at the kitchen counter and looked out at the backyard, at the garden she had planted in the spring, which was just starting to come up through the frost. She thought about all the meals she had made, all the pockets she had checked before doing the laundry, all the times she had made herself smaller so that there would be less of her to criticize. She turned around. I think you should stay at your brother's place for a while, she said. Kyle started to say something. She raised one hand just slightly and he stopped. I'm not saying forever, she said. I'm saying for now. I need to think. And I can't think with you here. He left that evening. He took a duffel bag and his laptop and his good winter coat. Before he got in the car, he stood in the driveway and looked at her through the front window in a way that she thought was meant to communicate something. She wasn't sure what. She raised her hand in a kind of farewell. He got in the car. She stood in the house, alone, and listened to the quiet. It was the first time in years that the quiet felt like hers. The months that followed were not easy. Nobody who tells you these stories honestly will pretend otherwise. Evelyn's mom drove down from Guelph the weekend after Kyle left and spent 3 days helping her go through the spare room where the textbooks were. Sandra was the kind of woman who helped by doing things alongside you, rather than for you, which was exactly what Evelyn needed. They drank tea at the kitchen table and talked about things they hadn't talked about in a long time, and sometimes they didn't talk at all, and that was fine too. I worried, her mom said, on the second evening. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to push. But I worried about what? Evelyn asked, though she already knew. Sandra wrapped both hands around her mug. About whether you were happy. Evelyn thought about that for a moment. I think I kept thinking I would be, she said, eventually, like I was in a phase that would end. Her mom nodded. Your dad and I had a phase like that, she said. About 12 years in, we almost didn't make it through. She paused. The difference was that we talked about it. Badly, and with a lot of yelling. But we talked about it. Evelyn thought about all the things she had not said to Kyle. All the conversations she had avoided because the effort of having them felt like more than she had the energy for. She had been conflict avoidant in a way that looked like peacekeeping, and she had paid for it in years. She started therapy that April. Her therapist was a calm, direct woman who seemed unimpressed by the stories Evelyn told herself about why things were the way they were. This was, it turned out, exactly what she needed. Evelyn had become very good at justifying. Her therapist was not interested in justifications. She was interested in what Evelyn actually felt. The two things, it turned out, were quite different. The contract work with the conservation organization expanded over the summer. By August, she was full-time. She had forgotten how much she liked having problems that required expertise, work that asked something real of her. She came home in the evenings pleasantly tired, in a way that felt different from the bone-deep fatigue she'd lived with for years without naming it. Kyle asked through a series of terse text messages whether she wanted to try counseling. She said she thought it was too late for that, and she meant it. She was not angry at Kyle exactly, or not only angry. She understood that two people can fail each other in parallel, that bad marriages are rarely the fault of a single villain. But she also understood that she could not go back to the version of herself who had checked his coat pockets and said nothing. She was done being that person. The divorce took 14 months to finalize. There were lawyers and documents and moments of exhausting logistical grief. The house was sold. Evelyn found a rental in Burlington, closer to her job, a second-floor apartment with big windows and a small balcony, where she immediately put 2 planters and some late-season herbs she had absolutely no business trying to grow in October. They died. She replanted them in the spring. Her dad, Ron, came to help her move. He was 71 years old, and he assembled her IKEA bookshelf with a focus and determination that she found deeply moving. When he finished, he stood back and looked at it with his hands on his hips, the way he always stood back from things he'd built. "That's a good shelf," he said. "It's a good shelf, Dad," she agreed. He patted her on the shoulder in the solid, wordless way that fathers sometimes communicate everything they can't put into language, and went to make tea. She stood in her new living room, surrounded by boxes that were entirely hers, in a space that was entirely hers, in a city where she had a job she had found herself, and a therapist she liked, and a balcony where things could theoretically grow if she paid better attention. She thought about the waiting room at St. Michael's, the paper cup of cold coffee, the child with the yellow crayon. She thought about what it had felt like to be 34 years old and sitting alone in a hospital, and to realize in the particular way that waiting rooms allow, that she had been waiting in other rooms for a very long time. She was done waiting. There are things that people don't tell you about starting over in your mid-30s. They tell you it's hard, and it is. They tell you it's brave, and sometimes that word lands the wrong way, like you're supposed to feel proud of yourself for surviving something you partly created. What they don't tell you is how strange and ordinary the good moments are. How a good morning, coffee while it's still hot, a walk before work, a project that's going well, can sit in your chest like something almost unbearably simple. Evelyn made a friend at the conservation organization, a researcher named Demi, who had lived in 5 cities and had strong opinions about everything, and made Evelyn laugh more than she had in years. She started going to a pottery class on Thursday evenings, something she had wanted to do since university, and had never gotten around to for reasons she could no longer fully explain. She called her mom more often. She visited her parents in Guelph on long weekends and sat in the garden with Sandra and her dad and felt quietly and without fanfare, something like herself. She did not start a new relationship, in that well-meaning way that people ask, and she said she wasn't in a hurry. She wasn't. She had spent years in a relationship that required her to be a certain shape, and she wanted time, real time, without an agenda, to find out what shape she actually was. She had the balcony plants. She had the pottery class. She had work that used her brain and a therapist who didn't let her off the hook, and a second-floor apartment in Burlington, with big windows and her own name on the lease. On a Thursday in November, almost 2 years after she had sat in that hospital waiting room, Evelyn came home from work and stood on her balcony in her coat, with a mug of tea, and looked out over the street below. The trees had lost most of their leaves. Someone was walking a dog that appeared to have no interest in walking in a straight line. The light was doing the thing it does in southern Ontario in November, low and golden, and a bit melancholy. The kind of light that makes ordinary streets look like something worth photographing. She stood there until the tea was cold. She thought about the woman she had been in that waiting room, scared, alone, someone else's unpaid housekeeper waiting for a medical result while her phone buzzed with a reminder about the basement. She thought about all the rooms she had waited in, and then she thought about how, 2 years from now, she had no idea what her life would look like, and how this was, for the first time in a very long time, not a frightening thought. It felt unexpectedly like something to look forward to.